member Jeff Klein. Today, Gaza in Context, the Colonial History That Shaped the Modern Middle East webinar topic is Mandates and Repression in Palestine and Beyond. Member Jeff Klein. Today, Gaza in Context, the Colonial History that... I'm sorry.
Needs to be an echo.
Okay. Is it all right now?
Yeah.
My name is Zarina Mehmet, and my co-host is Julie Jolin. This session is being recorded, and the chat will be muted during the presentation. As you may already know, this is a four-part series that was condensed from Jeff's popular course at UMass Boston Lifelong Learning Institute for almost 10 years, that is until 2023. This is a shorter version of the detailed course. The webinar is being held on Sundays with 2 more sessions after today's event. The next session will be held on January 26th. There is an important in-person conference next Sunday, Arise and Resist, being held at Roxbury Community College from 9:30 to 5. It will consist of lectures and breakout groups. And if you're interested, look at the webinar for MAPA. I'm sorry, look at the MAPA website. Last Sunday's slides and videos are available on MAPA website. Today's, as I mentioned, Jeff will discuss the mandates and repression in Palestine and beyond. He will explore the failure of the British colonial attempt to shape Palestine in conformance with the Balfour Declaration, Palestinian resistance and the first proposals for partition, Zionist terror, and British-French colonialism in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Let me remind you of Jeff's background. Jeff is also a member of Gaza Israel Mideast Peace Campaign's Working Group and Steering Committee. He's a veteran anti-war activist, active with Dorchester for Peace, a retired machinist, a local trade union president, and since 2004, Jeff has traveled to Palestine almost every year and last visited in 2022. He has traveled extensively in the Middle East and has many close friends in the region, especially in Palestine, Lebanon, and Jordan. Jeff is an avid reader and clearly understands this topic well. We're blessed to have him, and without further ado, here is Jeff.
Thank you, Serena, and thank you, Julie and Cole and MAPA for making this possible. And I'm very gratified. Many of you have made favorable comments about these presentations, and so far, over 1,000 people have watched it on YouTube, which is very encouraging. So I suppose I should thank UMass for their attempt to cancel me because it actually helped me to reach a larger audience. So that's all good. I'm going to start sharing my slides, and hopefully that will work okay. And we're going to start by reviewing some of the material from last week. So can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great.
You know, Jeff, it's really late to bring it up, but you're sitting in front of a window, and so there's a little contrast issue. It's okay, but it's
yeah,
not.
I know. I can't. This is a desktop computer, and it happens to be located in front of these windows, so
Yeah. Okay.
not much I can do about it.
Okay.
Just before going back to the historical background of putting Gaza in context, I certainly don't want us to lose sight of what's happening today in Gaza. And, you know, the brutality of the Israeli assault on Gaza and the people of Gaza is continuing. Just this week, the British medical journal, The Lancet, issued a report that suggested the official body count that's been issued by the health ministry in Gaza actually undercounted the casualties from the direct military attacks. And they suggest that the actual count as of now is over 60,000 people killed. And of course, tens of thousands wounded, including, you know, hundreds at least of amputees, including amputees of young children. And just a reminder, Gaza that you see, you know, the outline here that's been almost totally destroyed is 1/10 the size of Rhode Island, the smallest state in the United States. And with a population of 2 million, all of Rhode Island today has a population of about 1 million. And nearly everybody in Gaza has suffered from the Israeli assault. And by the way, the total tonnage of bombs and missiles and shells landed on this tiny strip of land is equivalent to 4 Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons. So you can imagine, this devastation is unparalleled in modern times. So back to the history, just reviewing a little bit, on the eve of the First World War, this was the Ottoman Empire that ultimately joined the Central Powers, again, because they understood that Britain and France, the two primary Allied powers, were going to dismember it anyway if they won. And of course, that's what happened. So their only hope of surviving was to ally with the Central Powers, Germany and Austro-Hungary primarily. This was in the face of European colonialism that had been eating away at their possessions for a century. And by the way, this map showing British possessions in pink, note here that around the Arabian Peninsula, there were numerous, basically, colonial protectorates of the British that led to the creation of the modern Gulf states, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, which was never conquered by the British. They were on the British payroll. So all of these states, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, the United Arab Republics, Oman,
All
Yemen,
right. Good luck.
were all British
I
possessions.
don't think so.
And again, the intent was to have continuous territories between Britain out on the, Western Europe, and the British possession of India, the Indian subcontinent here. So during the war, the British and its allies made a secret plan known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement to divide up the territory of the Ottoman Empire. And we've been concentrating on this area in the Arab-speaking Levant, as it's usually termed. But in fact, the Sykes-Picot Treaty was broader than that. And the signatories included Russia and Italy. And the plan was to dismember almost in its entirety not only the Arab-speaking dependencies of the Ottoman Empire, but Anatolia, the sort of Turkish core itself. The Russians were going to have Istanbul, Constantinople. The Italians were going to have a big chunk here. And although we're mostly concerned with this area that includes Palestine, we need to be aware that the aims of the Sykes-Picot Treaty were even broader than that. And of course, it changed when the Russians dropped out after the October Revolution. Their interest in Palestine became moot, and the British and French renegotiated so that Palestine, which had originally been supposed to be shared among the major allies, was given entirely to Britain. And here's again the original map of Sykes-Picot showing the dismemberment of the Turkish heartland. And the allies forced a treaty essentially agreeing to that on the remnants of the Ottoman Sultanate that was still surviving in Istanbul under Allied occupation. But this soon became moot as well, because there was the upsurge of a resistance movement led in Eastern Anatolia in the first place by Turkish officers, including Mustafa Kemal, who was the hero of the Turkish defense of the Dardanelles in the Gallipoli campaign. And they organized a successful resistance that reconquered most of what eventually became the modern state of Turkey, and also, not incidentally, established the southern borders of Turkey and the northern borders of its neighbors through the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923. One negative aspect of this is that, in establishing modern Turkey, or Turkiye in Turkish, as a sort of European-style ethnic state, it left out or led to the repression of the many minority peoples who were not Turkish. Even in this core region of the Ottoman Empire, there were substantial Armenian, Kurdish, and Greek minorities throughout this territory. The Armenians had been partly massacred in 1915 and 16. Their remnants were expelled, and so was the Greek. The coastland, the Aegean coastland of the Turkish state was heavily populated by Greeks who were expelled in the years after the establishment of the Turkish state. So, although it's good that Turkey managed to maintain its independence, on the other hand, copying the worst elements of the European kind of ethnic states, led to this idea that it was Turkish, ethnically Turkish and Muslim. And of course, that led to the kind of repression that played out in Europe over many centuries that we kind of take for granted and ignore. So in the Levant, again, that's a European term for the Eastern Mediterranean seaboard. What had been one cultural, linguistic area that was called in Arabic Bilad Asham, the land of Sham. Sham in Arabic just referred to the northern part of the Islamic world from the point of view of Arabia, further to the south. And Sham, by the way, also is the sort of colloquial name for the city of Damascus. It's called Sham. Even though in Arabic, Dimashq is the official name for the city. So what had been one sort of cultural, linguistic, and hoped for political zone was divided up by the Allies into several different countries, all under their sway, directly or indirectly. And before we get back to Palestine, I just want to briefly review how that played out elsewhere. The Syrians were given the mandate of Syria, and they proceeded to divide off and create a state of Lebanon here. And then the rest they divided up into smaller governorates in an attempt to sort of diminish Arab nationalism, which was based in the urban centers of Damascus and Aleppo. They divided the Sunni majority areas of Syria into two states. They created a separate state for the Druze majority in the south and the Alawite minority along the coast in the west. And again, this northern area was ultimately, just before the Second World War, was handed over to Turkey. So they effectively dismembered even their part of the Levant area. And to a degree, it did not succeed. In 1925, there was what the Arabs call the Great Syrian Revolt, which was in fact led by Druze militants, but it came to engulf most of Syria. It was put down with great difficulty. The leader was Sultan al-Atrash from Sueda, which is still a Druze majority city. And just as a aside, when I visited Sueda some years ago, we were received by al-Atrash's grandson at their family guest house. And with great irony, the people lined up to receive us were trying to speak to us in Spanish, because many of the Druze had gone to Latin America, especially Colombia and Venezuela, to sort of make their fortunes as expats, and came back with the money they earned and settled in back home in Sueda. And they kind of assumed that a bunch of foreigners would be more likely to understand Spanish than Arabic. So again, the reverberations of all this history is still very much alive today. Now, the French, in order to conquer Syria, had thrown out Faisal, the son of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca. He had been declared the king of Syria, and by Syria then they meant the Levant, Greater Syria, as we call it. The French kicked him out, again using mostly colonial troops, as they also did to put down the revolt in 1925. And Hussein was available then, and the British made him the king of Iraq. And oh, by the way, in terms of how this reverberates, the Alawites who lived in this area of the coast were the most sort of repressed and impoverished ethnic groups within Greater Syria. And therefore, the French concentrated on recruiting them in particular for their colonial army of occupation. And of course, that led ultimately to the sort of Alawite family of the Assads managing to gain power through the dominance of the military. And of course, that's the background for the modern history of Syria and the revolt that succeeded in overthrowing the Assad family. How that will proceed in the future is very much in doubt. And of course, the Alawites are very much targeted for revenge by the Islamist Sunni militants that have taken over Syria. So Faisal was made the king of Iraq, and the intention was that he would lead the local forces to repress the revolt against British rule that had broken out among the Shia majority communities in Iraq. And they succeeded ultimately, together with the use of British air power and possibly poison gas. And that monarchy in Iraq lasted until 1958 when it was overthrown. And, we'll get to that in the future. Meanwhile, the British took the Palestinian Mandate, which was larger than what became historic Palestine, and they divided it in two. They created the state of Transjordan, which is the ancestor of the modern state of Jordan, and reserved this smaller version of Palestine for Jewish settlement in conformity with the Balfour Declaration. And by the way, they put as the head of Transjordan, later Jordan, another brother of Faisal, son of Sharif Hussein, Abdullah, who again didn't come from there, and his family still rules Jordan. The current Abdullah, King Abdullah, is the great-grandson of the one that the British appointed. So back to Palestine, of course, the Balfour Declaration promised that Britain would advocate for a Jewish national home in Palestine. Again, the language left intentionally vague, whether this was a state or something else. The Zionists certainly believed that this was supposed to be a Jewish state, and the British should have pretended to be ambiguous about it. How did that turn out? Well, we're going to see in detail, but here you can see one graphic version of it.
The abandoned Arab village of Lifta at the western entrance to Jerusalem. Its inhabitants fled in early 1948, following an attack by Jewish militiamen. It was to this village that the leader of the Jewish community in Palestine, David Ben-Gurion, referred in a speech on February 7, 1948, as he prophesied, in effect, the coming depopulation of the Arab parts of the country.
And this is what he said. From your entry into Jerusalem through Lifta Romema, there are no strangers, and he meant, of course, Arabs. 100% Jews. Since Jerusalem's destruction in the days of the Romans, it hasn't been so Jewish as it is now. And he spoke then about the whole of the country. What had happened in Jerusalem could well happen in great parts of the country if we, that is the Jews, hold on. And if we hold on, it is very possible that in the coming 6 or 8 or 10 months of the war, there will take place great changes, and not all of them to our detriment. Certainly there will be great changes in the composition of the population of the country.
So we're going to see how that worked out in detail. But a few things to note right now is that, of course, this took place before the official declaration of independence of Israel and before any foreign Arab armies had entered the fray. And it also indicates that ethnic cleansing was part of the program of the Zionists from the very beginning. It was not something that happened accidentally during the war. It was part of their plan. And by the way, the youngish man that commented and read Ben-Gurion's letter was the historian Benny Morris, who was one of the new generation called new historians in Israel, who were primarily people of the left and progressives who demolished a lot of the mythology around the creation of Israel. Morris wrote a very influential book called The Origin of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, which debunked, the story that the Palestinians left voluntarily, but also, and very meaningfully, in his later years, Morris had become a vehement supporter of ethnic cleansing. And it kind of points out, and we'll meet him again later, it kind of points out that there's really no scope for a progressive or liberal version of Zionism. It's based on ethnic supremacy and ethnic cleansing, and it doesn't it contradicts in a fundamental way liberal and progressive values. Now, getting back to the British, perfidious Albion, the Balfour Declaration and their plans that were ratified in the conferences, in the immediate after-war years, was ultimately adopted by the League of Nations as a mandate. Remember, mandates were something new. It was like supposed to be temporary colonies. And the Balfour Declaration itself was incorporated in the League of Nations mandate along with this specific purpose that the mandatory, that is Great Britain, was to secure the establishment of the Jewish national home and the development of self-governing institutions while safeguarding the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine. And this was the fundamental contradiction that the British were never able to square, because if they allowed self-government, the overwhelming Arab majority was never going to agree to the establishment of a Jewish national home or state within their territory. And of course, as we know from what followed, the establishment of a Jewish state was anything but the guarantee or safeguarding of the civil and religious rights of the Arabs in Palestine. They had a kind of plan for how to square this circle that we'll see in a minute. But first, I want to look at this clip from a British documentary that shows the beginning of the mandate. And you can get an idea for the contradictions that the British were facing in their rule of Damascus. Oops.
This commemorative plaque in Jerusalem is a sad relic of the period of British rule in Palestine, the Palestine Mandate. On one side, it's inscribed in Hebrew. On the other side, in Arabic, the language of the majority. The English version lies in the painful ground between these two opposing camps, so to speak. Heading the list of names there is that of Sir Herbert Samuel, Britain's first High Commissioner in Palestine. Sir Herbert Samuel's very first act when he came there in 1920 to rule Palestine for Britain was to make Hebrew an official language. He thus discovered without delay what was to be an inescapable rule of life for him and his successors for 30 years. If you pleased one side, you offended the other. The British began by offending the Arabs. There were perhaps 60,000 Jews in Palestine at the time, and 500,000 or more Arabs. Why should this small minority of Jews, the Arabs asked, be given rights at all? The favor bestowed on the Jews by Sir Herbert Samuel made the Arabs angry and afraid. They felt it to be unjust. unjust or not, Sir Herbert Samuel's action was unavoidable. Encouraging the Jews, fostering a Jewish national home was a duty. It was the justification of Britain's presence there, and what the League of Nations mandate was mostly about. In appointing Samuel to implement that mandate, the British government left no doubt about the strength of their commitment to Zionism and the Jewish national home. For he was himself a Jew, as well as a trusty and reliable friend of the Zionist movement. Duty was made easier by personal inclination. Not unreasonably, the Arabs felt that the appointment of a Jew to the post of High Commissioner and the immigration of large numbers of foreign Jews with ill-defined and probably far-reaching political ambitions was likely to harm their interests. Feelings amongst these non-Jewish communities, as they were categorized in the League of Nations mandate, ran high. Arab feelings showed themselves even before Samuel's arrival in civil disturbances. Riots, fights, killings and arrests took place in 1920 and 21. These were sometimes associated with local religious festivals, which could turn easily into political demonstrations. What it all amounted to was something very simple. The Arabs did not want foreign Jews in large numbers in their country. The atmosphere in 1920 and 21 was tense. The Arabs complained bitterly about the way they were being treated. But all this was to no purpose. The new colonial secretary, Winston Churchill, visited Palestine in 1921. "It is not in my power," he said then, "to repudiate the Balfour Declaration." The mandate stood. The deal Britain had made, the undertaking given, and the British interests served by it, this is what mattered to the British. Arab unrest led him a year later to issue a white paper, calculated to cool them down. But on the crucial and explosive issues, the right of Jews to go there, to live there as of rights, to buy land, invest, build up their own political institutions, on all these, Churchill would not compromise. On these, he gave nothing of substance. It was this, the resolute and determined support given by successive British governments, which enabled the Jewish nationalist movement in Palestine to take root there and grow.
So, perfidious Albion. I guess I just want to emphasize that the indigenous resistance to the Zionist project began immediately after the conquest of Palestine. By the way, when Balfour made his declaration, the area that we know of Palestine today was still under Ottoman rule. It wasn't until the end of 1917 and during the course of 1918 that the British Army managed to conquer Jerusalem and then Lebanon, Beirut, and Damascus in Syria. And by the way, the British Army in Palestine, as it was in many theaters, was primarily Australian and Indian in makeup, with British officers in command. So here was the problem. They were committed to imposing the Balfour idea of a Jewish national home in Palestine in a country that was overwhelmingly populated by people who were not Jewish. And the pie chart on the right shows an estimate of the population at that time, where the Jewish population was somewhere between 5 and 7%, and the rest were Arab speakers, primarily Muslims, but also a substantial Christian minority. And again, I remind you that of the Jews who lived in Palestine, the long-term Jewish residents, historical residents, were not Zionists. Zionists came from Europe and began to settle in Palestine in the late 1800s and the years before the First World War, but this was making very little headway. In fact, many of the people who had come to settle in Palestine before the First World War ended up leaving because they came from urban areas in Europe, Eastern Europe primarily, and were just not prepared or willing to become agricultural pioneers. And so the British idea was, through immigration, maybe eventually there'd be a Jewish majority in Palestine, and then they could allow self-determination to be voted by a majority in favor of a Jewish state. But it didn't work out that way. I'm reminding you that Zionism for most of the 19th and 20th century was very much a minority movement among the Jews of the world, even a fringe movement for most of that time. And the Jews who wanted to emigrate, particularly from the Russian Empire, which then included Poland as well, didn't go to Palestine. Their aim was to go to America in particular. Almost 2 million emigrated during these years to America. And the second choices were other British colonial possessions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, and so on. And only a very, very small minority made their way to Palestine. And as I said, many of those did not choose to stay. And even with the rise of the Nazis and, the physical threat of potential extermination of the Jews, those who could flee Nazi Germany, again, overwhelmingly wanted to go anyplace else but Palestine. A fairly significant number did end up going to Palestine because it was difficult to emigrate by then to the United States and Britain. But again, it was a minority. And if they were free to enter the United States, even more of them would have done so. By this time, the U.S. had changed its immigration laws in 1924 to basically restrict immigration. It had been basically open to anyone who wanted to come before then. So they had a hard time, the German Jews had a hard time making it into the United States. So what happened in Palestine was that the Jewish community did increase, and particularly in the 1930s, this line shows immigration. The increase was almost entirely by immigration, but so did the Arab majority community, so that by the eve of Israeli independence, the Jews were still no more than 1/3 of the total population of the land. And ironically, as the Jews in Europe were facing a really dire future, the Zionists opposed every effort to rescue the Jews of Europe unless it meant they would go to Palestine. And a very significant episode was the organization of the children's transport from primarily from Austria after the Germans had taken it over. The British, who were reluctant to allow large-scale Jewish immigration, kind of made an exception to accept children. And Ben-Gurion, as the spokesperson for the Zionists, opposed this, as they opposed every other effort meant to save the Jews of Europe. And he said famously, if I knew it was possible to save all the children of Germany by their transfer to England and only half of them by transferring them to Eretz Israel, I would choose the latter, because we are faced not only with the accounting of these children, but also with the historical accounting of the Jewish people. And that policy was maintained consistently during and immediately after the Second World War. So obviously the Palestinians resisted as best they could, but they were facing not only the Zionist movement within Palestine, but the British Empire itself. And it was a very unequal struggle. But here's part of a documentary from Al Jazeera that speaks to that.
By the late 1920s, the rising number of settlers led to resentment and clashes. The Palestinians did not view these new European arrivals as immigrants, but as colonists. In the 1920s and 30s, as the numbers of Jews reached new peaks, the Palestinians, supported by their Arab neighbors, began their resistance. There were armed clashes, both with Jewish settlers and with British troops.
The culmination of the Palestinian resistance happened in the famous revolt of 1936-39. This is a period which is usually put in the shade, but that was the climax of the tragic dilemma of the Palestinian people, where they had to fight two enemies. They had to fight British mandate and they had to fight Israeli settlement. So you have in 1936, 1939, a general strike of 1 year, you have a rural guerrilla warfare of 3 years, which led the British to reconquer Palestine with 30,000 British troops.
صار لليهود شبه دولة قائمة.
The Jews had an almost complete state. While our leadership was being dismantled, our leaders arrested and for the most part exiled to the Seychelles Islands in the Indian Ocean.
عدد كبير منهم إلى جزر سيشل في المحيط الهندي. وصل عدد
In
المعتقلين
1938, the number of detainees reached 50,000. Their detention was to be reviewed after 2 years. It was the most violent year of our struggle.
إلى 50,000.
And by the way, one of the early martyrs of the uprising of the Palestinians in 1935 to 39 was a Syrian-born cleric who had moved to Haifa. His name was Izzeddin al-Qasim, and he was killed by the British at the end of 1935. And of course, his name was adopted as to designate the Hamas military forces, who are called the Al-Qassam Brigade. So he's still a hero of Palestinian resistance. So the British were in a quandary, both because of the upsurge of resistance to their project in Palestine and the fact that it was becoming increasingly unlikely that there was going to be Jewish demographic majority in Palestine. So they raised for the first time the idea of partitioning their mandate into a Jewish and a Palestinian state. And that's shown in this map. What was to be a Jewish state, much smaller than eventually became Israel, is shown in purple here. And the rest was to be an Arab state. And again, the British reserved Jerusalem and a sort of corridor to the sea, to Jaffa, as an international zone under their control. And it's not true, as it's often said, that basically the Jews accepted this and the Arabs refused. The Zionists accepted in principle the possibility of partition. They never accepted the borders, the limited borders of what was to become a Jewish state. And of course, the Arabs were unanimous in opposing it, because part of the plan of this partition was that the Arabs living in what was to become a Jewish state would be ethnically cleansed out of the area, and the rest would somehow be tied and ruled by Jordan. And again, if you see on the map here, the proposed partition corresponded to the large-scale Jewish land ownership and settlement in Palestine, with the exception of the very fertile central part of Galilee, which had almost no Jews in it, but was to become a part of the Jewish state after the Arabs were removed. This broke down, basically became impossible. The Arabs opposed it, and the Jews only saw it as a limited advance, a first step. So it was shelved for the time being. Meanwhile, a few years later, the Second World War was looming, and the British were getting increasingly concerned with their presence in the Arab majority and Muslim majority Middle East, where their oil came from. And they issued a kind of change of policy called the White Paper of 1939, in which they said basically that they have met their responsibility under the Balfour Declaration for a Jewish national home. That is, there were a lot of Jews that had settled in Palestine. And they determined that there would be an independent Palestinian state within 10 years that would effectively be self-determination, in which the Arabs and Jews would share a government in proportion. And they also temporarily restricted Jewish immigration into Palestine and Jewish land ownership. This was regarded by the Zionists as a declaration of war on their project. And in particular, the right-wing extreme of the Zionist movement launched a war of terror against the British occupying forces. Bombings, assassinations, blowing up railroad tracks, and so on. And most famously, the blowing up of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem in 1946, in which almost 100 people were killed, including many Jews who worked for the British administration. And of course, the British were pretty clear in determining this as terrorism, as they called it, Jewish terrorists. And again, the mainstream of the Zionist movement were still mostly focused on the defeat of Nazism, but the right wing, the revisionist wing of the Zionist movement, was pretty openly fascist at that time. Still today, they are the ancestors of the modern Likud party. And Jabotinsky, their ideological leader, was very enamored of Mussolini-style fascism. They obviously were not pro-Nazi in the sense that the Nazis had already declared their aim to destroy the Jewish population, but they liked Mussolini, and they were fascists in the more general term. So, by the way, at the end of the Second World War, in 1945, there were several 100,000 Jewish survivors of the Nazi elimination campaign, either who had managed to hide out or escape the concentration camps or survive them. And for many reasons, most of them felt it was difficult or impossible for them to return to their previous homes in Poland and other areas of Eastern Europe. And they lived on in what were called displaced persons camps. And surveys at the time indicated that the majority of them wanted to go to the United States or Britain. But neither of those countries was very sympathetic to large-scale Jewish immigration. And in effect, they handed over the control of these displaced persons camps to the Zionists. And you see that in the lower right, who basically agitated that all of these people in these camps, particularly military-age young men, should be allowed to go to Palestine, which at that time the British had limited, in order to keep their relations with the Arab countries, had limited Jewish immigration. So this is the background for that publicity campaign around the ship, the Exodus, and so on. It was a real dilemma, and the British did not know how to deal with it. Again, they on the one hand, they wanted the Arab countries to be friendly. On the other hand, they were theoretically committed on humanitarian grounds to accommodating Jewish refugees, and they could never square that. So again, in the face of this guerrilla campaign by the Zionists against them, that the British called terrorism, and the impoverished situation of the British in the wake of the Second World War. Remember, Britain had suffered economically and was just not capable of maintaining a large occupation force in Palestine. So before too long, they effectively gave up and decided to throw the Palestinian question to the UN. Oops.
Britain announced that she has had enough. Speaking to the United Nations Committee on Palestine, Colonial Secretary Creech Jones said,
I repeat again that His Majesty's government have determined to base their policy on the assumption that they must lay down the mandate, under which they have sought for 25 years to discharge their obligations to fulfill the growth of the Jewish national home and to protect the interests of the Arab population. In order that there may be no misunderstanding of the attitude and policy of Britain, I have been instructed by His Majesty's government to announce with all solemnity that they have consequently decided that in the absence of a settlement, they must plan for an early withdrawal of British forces and of the British administration from Palestine.
The Palestine Mandate handed to Britain set out to establish a national home for the Jews, while at the same time the civil and religious rights of the Arabs were to be respected. Neither of the parties was satisfied. In the 1930s, British troops had to quell an Arab revolt. In the past 2 years, Irgun and Stern gangs brought the situation to boiling point. The cost to all sides in human lives has been high. In the latest outrage at Haifa, police headquarters was wrecked by a bomb, killing 10 and wounding 50. Contradictory British diplomacy over the years has not helped the search for a solution. great traditional and economic differences have stood between Jew and Arab. Yet the world has offered Britain advice in plenty. Now Britain cuts her losses. It is for the United Nations to face the problem of Palestine.
So the United Nations undertook, as the successor organization to the League of Nations, undertook to send a committee to study the question in Palestine, and came up with a recommendation, a majority recommendation, that Palestine be partitioned between a Jewish Zionist state and an Arab Palestinian state. And this came up for a vote in the United Nations in November of 1947. And the General Assembly adopted, the majority adopted the plan for partition. Incidentally, the UN, of course, in those days was much smaller than it became later. And the US dominated politically and economically many of the Latin American nations that were voting members, and did a lot of arm twisting to get people to support this resolution. And ironically, the USSR and the Soviet bloc also supported it on the theory that this was a blow against British colonialism, and that the Zionists at that time professed to be social democrats or socialists in majority, and therefore the Soviet Union and its allies, for maybe the only major issue in the Cold War, agreed with the United States. So the proposal was carried. And again, I emphasize the proposal was to recommend the partition of Palestine into two states. The actual process was to be undertaken by the UN in consultation with the local inhabitants. It was not, as the Zionists claimed, the UN did not vote to create the state of Israel. It voted for a process that might lead to a Jewish state. And of course, it was never adopted by the Security Council, which had was the enforcement arm of the UN. So here's the partition plan that was adopted. Again, you see in sort of yellow what was proposed to be a Jewish state. Again, they tried to limit the Jewish state to the areas where there was large Jewish populations or landholding, and they also added to it the sparsely populated area of the Nakba Negev Desert, where very few Jews lived, but the idea was to provide territory where Jewish immigration could expand into. And again, this sort of hopscotch version of a Palestinian state was shown here in gray. And of course, the Palestinians never accepted this idea of partition of their homeland because they expected decolonialization and self-determination, in which the majority would determine the political future of their territory. And of course, this never happened. And by the way, the Zionists were very careful to negotiate secretly with the government, the Jordan government in Amman, to forestall the creation of a Palestinian state. They preferred to have it ruled by the Jordanians, which was secretly agreed to. And by the way, again, in this agreement, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, the sort of sacred basin, was to be under international control. And that's why, since this was never rescinded, that's why until quite recently, all the countries that had diplomatic relations with Israel had their embassies in Tel Aviv, not in Jerusalem, until Donald Trump decided otherwise just a few years ago. And again, I remind you that in 1946-47, the Jewish population was only 1/3, and yet they were allocated more than half the land of Palestine. And here's another way of looking at it. Although land ownership was sort of common in this area that was reserved for a Jewish state, in fact, the population was not. The only area of Palestine where there was a clear Jewish majority was in sort of greater Tel Aviv. The Jewish population is shown in blue, the Palestinians in green. And they had almost half the population of Haifa, but in all the rest of the lands allocated to the Jewish state, the Jewish population was pretty nominal, except for Jerusalem, again, which was supposed to be international. So the UN committee that proposed this was at pains to create the largest possible territory that would have a nominal Jewish majority. But the Jewish majority in the proposed Jewish state was a bare majority. And the Zionists who accepted this partition well understood that their viability as a Jewish state depended on removing the maximum number of Arab inhabitants. And in fact, here's another way of looking at it. The 55% Jewish majority in the Jewish state, they managed to include basically every area that could be plausibly contained in a Jewish settlement area. It was only a bare majority of Jews, 55 to 45%. The Arab Palestinian state, of course, had very few Jews living in it. So this was the contradiction that there could not be a permanent, lasting Jewish state with such a large Palestinian minority. And in fact, the ethnic cleansing by the Zionists began right after the UN adoption of the partition plan and before there was a state of Israel.
Palestinians and Arabs protested the United Nations partition plan, giving the Jewish state 56% of the area of Palestine. The Jews and the Palestinians prepared for a confrontation, and although the Palestinians outnumbered the Jews 2-1, the Jews were better prepared and well armed. They had a semi-independent government led by David Ben-Gurion, and their military, the Haganah, was well trained and experienced. The Palestinians, on the other hand, had never recovered from the Arab revolt against the Ottomans, and most of their leaders were in exile.
So the most famous massacre perpetrated by the Zionists before independence was in April 1948, and this was the attack on Deir Yassin, which was a Palestinian village on the western outskirts of Jerusalem. And again, this would have been part of the international zone, but the Zionists launched an offensive against Deir Yassin and Lifta and other towns. And in Deir Yassin, it was led by the Irgun and Lehi, the two extremist branches of the Zionist military, and they killed approximately 100 people and expelled the rest and paraded them in Jerusalem. But they exaggerated the number because they wanted to create a terror that would frighten the rest of the Palestinians to leave, and they succeeded in that. And just in passing, Albert Einstein, who was a social democrat for all his political life, joined with others to condemn this as a fascist massacre. When they wrote this letter to the New York Times, Menachem Begin, the leader of the Irgun, which was behind the bombing of the King David Hotel, was carrying out a fundraising tour in the United States. And Einstein and his fellow signatories had no hesitation in calling this a terrorist attack and condemning the perpetrators as fascists. But it did have its effect. And the exodus of Palestinians from their homes began before the Declaration of Independence, and it was accelerated by the news of the massacres at Deir Yassin. People fled on foot toward Lebanon or Jordan, by sea toward Cairo or Beirut. And of the 750,000 Palestinians that were expelled from historic Palestine, half of them left before the Declaration of Independence by Israel. That happened in May 14th, 1948. And again, this was a unilateral declaration of independence. It was not created by the UN. But of course, this led to what the Zionists and pro-Israel people celebrate this as Israel Independence Day. The Palestinians, of course, remember it as the Nakba, the catastrophe. And it's worth pointing out that when Israel was declared its independence in 1948, they specified that within a few months they were going to adopt a constitution based on sort of liberal opinions with equal rights for everybody, and that this constitution was supposed to be finished by October of the same year, 1948. And it's worth noting that to this day, Israel does not have a constitution. The reason is that it was impossible to put in writing a sort of liberal sounding constitution that also guaranteed Jewish Zionist supremacy within the state of Israel. And also because to this day, there's disagreement then and now about who exactly is a Jew. And the compromise that was reached that still exists today is that for civil purposes, any person who can claim a Jewish grandparent is allowed to emigrate under the law of return and become a citizen of Israel. But who is a Jew is determined by rabbinical law. And many of those immigrants that were allowed in by the Zionists are not officially considered Jews by the rabbis. And of course, to this day, private law, birth, marriage, death, is controlled by rabbinical law and not civil law. And that's why there is no intermarriage between different faiths within Israel or same-sex marriage either, despite Israel claiming that is a haven for gay and lesbian communities, because marriage is controlled by the rabbis. And there's a workaround that they have that people can get married abroad and come back and they will receive civil recognition. But the children of mixed marriages are not regarded rabbinically as Jews unless they undertake conversion. And so therefore, when hundreds of thousands of Soviet Jews came to Israel in the 1980s, most of them were not officially declared Jews by the rabbis. So the Nakba, Palestinians either fled or expelled from most of the country. At least 750,000 were registered officially as refugees, and they went either to the Jordanian-occupied West Bank, to Gaza, which remained under Egyptian control, Lebanon and Syria, and so on. And again, the myth is that they left of their own accord. There are many examples of massacres and atrocities committed by the Zionist armies. I show you just one example. This is the town in the Galilee called Elabun, and a friend of mine, Hannah Swade, who was a Palestinian member of the Knesset, is standing in front of a monument commemorating the massacre that took place there when the Zionists bombed and attacked the village. 12 people were shot, and the rest were expelled. But unusually, most of them were allowed to return because this was a Roman Catholic village, and the Pope intervened, and it was for public relations purposes. It was a bad look. So these Christians were allowed to return to that village. After the Israeli declared independence, the neighboring Arab countries intervened militarily, but it wasn't primarily or possibly to exterminate the Jewish state. It was mostly to defend the Palestinian population in the areas that the UN had designated as a Palestinian state. You can see mostly it was in the West Bank and the Galilee that the intervention took place. But the Israeli military was much more powerful at that time than these neighboring states, some of whom had only recently come out of colonial control. They had very weak armed forces. And in the case of the Jordanian army, it was actually commanded by a British national, and clearly was carrying out British policy. So there was no aim or even likelihood to wipe out the Jewish state. And in fact, as a result of these wars, the Jewish-controlled areas of Palestine actually expanded. You see here in orange the places that the Palestinians were defeated and the Zionists carried out their ethnic cleansing in these areas. So Israel became to be more than 70% of the area of Palestine, as opposed to the 55% or so that had been allocated by the UN. And again, they were never held to account of that. In theory, after the armistice, Israel should have been compelled to move back to its United Nations designated borders, but that never happened. And of course, the Palestinians who fled or expelled lived as refugees in the neighboring areas, and those who tried to return to their villages were, in many instances, killed. They were certainly denied the right to return to their villages. They were called infiltrators, the ones who tried to return home, and were forcibly blocked from doing that then as now. And the result was these dots here, hundreds of Palestinian villages were depopulated and destroyed. You see the ruins. If you look carefully around Israel, you can see the ruins of these places. This is Lubia, a town in the central part of Israel. And this is Ein Hod on the coast south of Haifa, where the local mosque was turned into a Jewish restaurant that I have visited. And, you know, they also created the kind of Orwellian designation of what they call present absentees. The absentees, the people who fled beyond the borders of Israel, of course, under Israeli law, lost all their property, and it was expropriated to benefit the Jewish National Fund. Those who moved out of their villages but stayed within Israel were called present absentees, and they also were never allowed to return to their homes, even though they still lived within Israel, and their land was confiscated. These are two elderly people in Tira, whose village was here. This is the remnants of it, and were still alive, living just a few miles from their former homes. And by the way, the trees you see planted here were intentionally placed all over Israel to obscure the remnants, the ruins of Palestinian villages. And many of this tree planting was financed by the nickels and dimes of Jewish Hebrew school students in the United States who were donating to plant a tree in Israel without understanding that these trees were meant to obscure Palestinian villages. And here's another very, extreme example. The town of Safuria, which is just north of Nazareth, was a large, during the 40s, had over 4,000 inhabitants. And again, it was attacked. The people were forcibly expelled. And this is a view of the same, from the same spot today, where you can see occasionally little ruins, but most of the site of the village was planted over by trees to obscure that it had once been an Arab village. So again, we're winding up this period, but I want to note that the UN, which wanted to enforce both the international nature of Jerusalem and the right of the Palestinians to remain in their homes, sent a special mediator to Palestine, who was a Swedish Count Folke Bernadotte, whose track record included saving many Jews during the Second World War from the Nazi potential extermination. And because he was there to enforce the UN partition, he was assassinated by Jewish extremists. And if the first major well-known atrocity, the blowing up of the King David Hotel, was masterminded by Menachem Begin, the assassination of Bernadotte was masterminded by Yitzhak Shamir, both of whom became Israeli prime ministers eventually. So the UN passed and then reconfirmed every year since then resolution demanding that the Palestinians be allowed to return to their homes, Resolution 194. And of course, this never happened. And Israel, although it had to agree to this nominally in order to be accepted into the UN, it was never enforced. They were accepted into the UN while never agreeing to the UN mandates. So here we see the Israel as we knew it between 1948 and 1967, again, expanded from the UN partition agreement. And here is Palestine, as it stands now, which is entirely controlled by the Zionists, even though there is probably a Palestinian majority living between the Jordan River and the sea. the official policy of the Likud government is that there will never be an independent Palestinian state from the river to the sea. They almost use that exact language. And that's the situation today. And I just want to end, the Palestinians who lived in refugee camps in 1948 now occupy sort of slums, effectively refugee camp slums in Lebanon, in Jordan, and so on, that had become sort of semi-permanent neighborhoods as opposed to refugee camps. And finally, I want to end with this. The Arab League, which was founded during the Second World War, already understood that British policy and Zionist power was going to lead to the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine that was going to be a catastrophe for the Arab indigenous inhabitants. And one of the first documents that they adopted was this one. The question of the Jews in Europe that were persecuted by Europeans should not be solved by forcing the Palestinians to pay the price for it. For there can be no greater injustice and aggression than solving the problem of the Jews of Europe by another injustice. And of course, that's what came to be. And you could argue that the Palestinians were the last victims of the Jewish Holocaust in Europe. So we'll stop there for now, and we have
Great.
some questions.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was amazing. The videos were incredible. The visuals were incredible. The information was very, very helpful. Your thoughts were insightful. There's so much historical detail that was not covered by our current media. We're going to open up to questions and answer session now. And I just want to remind you, in case I didn't before, the session is being recorded and will be available on YouTube Mappa channel as well as Mass Peace Action website. I do have a question I saw. Let me just get to that. Sorry. So there was a question by woman Tina. If they were so concerned about refugees, why didn't they not give their own country? They had no right to give Palestine to the Jewish refugees. It was a criminal act, and the UN partition was a second criminal act that had resulted in all the misery that Palestinians have faced ever since. Shame on Britain and the UN for this, and shame on all the criminal West for complicity in the genocide that has resulted from this criminality from more than 80 years ago. I am appalled. So she's talking about why didn't the British give them their own country? I mean, this.
Oh, I'm appalled. So again, for all the reasons that we've talked about, I mean, Palestine was regarded as a special case because of the adoption of the Balfour Declaration that became British policy. So it was never allowed to be decolonized like all the other imperial possessions that were decolonized at the end of the Second World War. And it was regarded as a special case because of the European commitment and I would say guilt about the Holocaust in Europe. And instead of paying the price themselves, as the questioner said, they forced the Palestinians to pay the price for it. And, that's the short story of what happened. And again, I remind you that there were hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Arab majority states in North Africa and the Middle East and in Persian Iran. And Zionism had almost no impact among those people. They were not Zionists. With a tiny number of exceptions, because they were never persecuted systematically as the Jews had been in Europe. Now, they were a religious minority, and sometimes life was not always rosy for them, but the kind of racialized anti-Semitism that grew up in Europe never had a serious foothold in the Middle East, except among a fringe that was influenced by Nazi ideology among the Arabs. So one catastrophe that also happened as a result of the creation of Israel was the elimination, basically, of most of the historic Jewish populations in the Arab world. They were not Zionists, but the creation of Israel as a Jewish state, which claimed to represent Jews everywhere, created a very uncomfortable position for them in the Arab world. And the Zionists, moreover, actively campaigned through fake false flag attacks in Iraq in particular to scare the Jews into leaving. And many of them did leave. A lot of them went to Israel, but those who had any choice about it went someplace else. So the Algerian Jews went to France. Many of the Persian Jews, if they could, went to France or the United States. And but effectively, these centuries-long Jewish communities in the Middle East were mostly extinguished, except for Iran. There's a substantial Jewish population that still survives in Iran. So that's another tragedy that came out of the sort of Zionist movement that is unspoken. The Zionists use this as a way of attacking, say, you know, we don't have to accept the Palestinians back because you expelled all the Jews. But that's an oversimplification. Basically, the Jews, for a variety of reasons, felt they had to leave. And by the way, the Jews from Arab lands that went to Israel were very badly treated. Remember, the Zionist movement was a European movement. And they regarded even the Jews who came from Yemen and Iraq as kind of lesser colonial people. And they were put in camps. They were flooded with DDT to eliminate the diseases they were thought to carry, and were discriminated against by the European Zionist establishment in Israel for the first decades of Israel's existence. And as a consequence, most of them drifted to the right and became the base of support of the Likud party, because they blamed the European-dominated leftist liberal Zionist parties as their oppressors. It's kind of like the Trumpist support from the working class for as revenge against the elites that they blame. And that's the political base of the Likud party today, is the fairly large community that has its roots in the Arab nations. And by the way, they were repressed. They were forced to give up their culture and their language. And there's, a lot of resentment for that still. They were Arabs in language and culture, and they had to choose between being Arabs or Jews. And of course, most of them chose to be Jews because that was the route to privilege in Palestine. So that's another unsung consequence of Zionism.
Serena, should I ask the next question?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
There are a lot of thank yous in this chat, Jeff. And the question is, would you mind speaking on Nazi support for Zionism?
Well, of course, it's a mixed thing. Before the outbreak of the Second World War, the Nazi aim was to export their Jewish population, basically. And for this purpose, especially given that open-door immigration was not available in Western Europe and the United States, they figured that Palestine would be a place to send the Jews. And as I mentioned last time, Adolf Eichmann visited Palestine in the 1930s to sort of look into the possibility of sending the Jews, the German Jews, to Palestine. And ultimately, the Nazis signed an agreement with the Zionist movement, allowing German Jews, only if they went to Palestine, to take some property with them. And the property was to consist of German manufactured goods, which violated the boycott, the international boycott against Germany that was promulgated by Jews in Britain and the United States. But the Zionists made a deal with the Nazis, basically, to facilitate the immigration of Jews to Palestine, and broke the boycott. So the Nazis were not exactly Zionists, but before the war, they saw a sort of confluence of agreement with the Zionists. And among the Zionists, this was quite outspoken, that they could deal with the Nazis. That is, until the outbreak of the war and the extermination program, they made took every opportunity to reach agreement with the Nazis, because, again, as I said last time, Zionism understood that anti-Semitism was its best ally, and that the Nazi persecution of Jews would be good if it meant that Jews go to Palestine and help to create a Jewish state. And that was their policy all along. And of course, it's still their policy today.
This is really sad. I mean, there's a clear psychology behind this strategy of country formation. There was a question here that was about, please explain more about the 36-39 Palestinian uprising. What caused it and what was the outcome?
Well, as I said, I mean, it was resistance. The Palestinians resisted the Zionist project from the get-go, even before the First World War, by the way, because Zionists were trickling into Palestine starting in the 1880s, what the Zionists called the first Aliyah. And as happened in many places in the world, the threat of colonialism helped to foster the development of indigenous nationalism. So although the Palestinians, for the most part, regarded themselves as part of the larger Levantine greater Syrian community, the impact of Zionism and Zionist settlement began to create the idea of a sort of territorial identification and nationalism in Palestine proper. So, of course, it's part of Zionist propaganda that there were never such a thing as the Palestinian people. But, of course, the Palestinians, like many countries under colonial influence, began to develop their nationalism pretty early on. The first sort of national newspaper within Palestine was founded in Jaffa in 1911 and was called Palestine. And it was founded, by the way, by two Greek Orthodox Arab Palestinian brothers. And it was a response. Palestine, being the aim of Zionism and British imperialism, created this corresponding nationalism. And by the 30s, again, they began to resist Palestinian settlement from the get-go after the British occupation, but it finally culminated in a large-scale resistance, including an armed resistance during the Great Revolt in 1936 to 39. And it wasn't just a military revolt. There were general strikes and civil disobedience, refusal to pay taxes, and, military actions, but they were very weak compared to the British Army that they were confronting. They were confronting both the British Army and the Zionist militias, and they failed basically to achieve national independence. That was their goal, was national independence for Palestine and a state with majority rule in which Jews who had roots in Palestine were perfectly welcome to stay, but outsiders from Europe should be stopped like any other country. A country should be able to control who comes and who doesn't come into their country. And that was their aim. And of course, it was effectively self-determination, which was thwarted by the British and then the United Nations and recognized since then. If there had been a vote of self-determination in 1946 or 47, there would have been a Palestinian state with a Jewish minority. And of course, that was never allowed to happen.
Julie, you want to go next?
Yeah, sort of on a different topic. How did the presence of oil in the Middle East affect British mandate policies in Palestine?
Well, we're going to talk about oil next time because you may have noticed, where was the United States in all of this? I barely mentioned the U.S. In this history that we're talking about. And of course, oil was very important. It was important for the British also. There was no oil or gas known then in Palestine, but the British controlled the oil fields in Iraq and Iran. And they were fearful that in the event of the World War, that Arab opposition to the Zionist project and the Balfour Declaration would threaten British access to oil. And that was why, had a lot to do with why they changed their policy in 1939 to begin to limit Jewish immigration into Palestine and foresee eventual self-determination by majority rule. And this was what launched the Zionist terror campaign against them and made their staying in Palestine untenable. You know, as I recounted, but oil, Israel and Palestine are important for the U.S., as we'll see, but it wasn't the only interest in the Middle East. And of course, certainly oil and the Cold War is what we're going to look at next time.
I have a couple quick questions that I think are interesting. First, is Israel considered legitimate by the UN? And also, when did the Christian Zionists play a role in Israel?
So Israel is recognized by the UN within the armistice borders of 1949. And again, this is already backing off from their original partition plan. They recognized expanded Israel as a state and admitted them to the UN, again, under the condition that it abide by UN decisions, including the right of return that was passed by the General Assembly. Of course, it never did this, and Israel has effectively not been held accountable under international law for any of its actions. And of course, I remind you that Jerusalem was not supposed to be controlled by the Jewish state. It was supposed to be international. And of course, they conquered part of it in 1948, 49, and annexed the rest of it, which is effectively part of the West Bank after 1967. And although the UN General Assembly has reiterated the right of return and reiterated condemnation of the expanded Jewish state, it has never recognized under international law Jewish control over East Jerusalem or the Syrian Golan Heights. Basically, the U.S. protects them from any consequences, because the only body in the UN that can apply consequences militarily or economically is the Security Council, where the U.S. has veto and has vetoed dozens of resolutions on about Israel and Palestine, including during the Israeli assault on Gaza for the last year and a half. We vetoed every effort for the Security Council to demand a ceasefire, even though the U.S. was alone among those states. It has veto power, so unless the U.S. agrees, the Security Council can't act, and that's been the situation since forever. So Israel has essentially been had impunity from international law, and as you probably may have followed the Netanyahu and his defense secretary were indicted by the International Criminal Court, along with two Palestinian leaders in Gaza. Both of those were killed by the Israelis, but the warrant for the arrest of Netanyahu and Gallant are in standing. And the first thing that the new Congress did substantially was to apply sanctions against the International Criminal Court for daring to hold Netanyahu and Gallant accountable. And that's been the situation ever since.
Did you want to comment about the Christian Zionists, or we'll hold off that too?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think I mentioned last time, I mean, Christian Zionism is older than Jewish Zionism. It's an important force today in the politically in the United States. It's part of a key part of the Republican electoral coalition. And they are recognized now by the Israeli government, especially the right wing, as their most important allies in the United States. And never mind that they believe the end times, when they come and Jesus returns, the Jews will be massacred if they don't convert to Christianity. The Zionists are happy to sort of ignore that, because they know that's, you know, they regard that as ridiculous. And by the way, I'll come back to this, but the biggest Christian Zionist organization in the United States, Christian United for Israel, its founding executive director was a Jewish Zionist, not a Christian. And its co-director today is Jewish as well. And they have been financed and elevated by pro-Israel foundations and the Israeli government ever since, even though, as I said, their idea of the end times is that the Jews will cease to exist. But the Zionists kind of ridicule that. So Christian Zionism as a political force in the United States did not come about naturally. It was fostered both by right-wing Republicans and by Zionists in the United States. It has roots, long roots in branches of Christianity, but as a political movement, it's quite recent decades.
Julie, you want to take the last question?
Sure. There are many questions in this chat, and I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question, but I wanted to ask Jeff, here's a question. Did Einstein consistently over his career call Zionist actions terrorist in nature? Do you know?
Well, I can't say. He certainly did call out Zionist terror and fascism in that letter I referred to. He identified for his whole life as a Jew, but he was not a Zionist. And in fact, they tried to recruit him to be the first president of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And of course, he refused. So at that time, in particular, progressive opinion, left-wing opinion in the United States, Jewish and non-Jewish, was not Zionist. And of course, still true, partly true today. So Einstein was a moral voice, and he condemned Zionist terrorism, especially around Deir Yassin, the massacres at Deir Yassin, and bore witness to that. But that's been swept under the rug historically. The idea that there were important Jewish figures who opposed Zionism from the beginning is not something that were talked about very much.
I think this went very well. There was a lot of information. I learned tremendous amount, Jeff. I mean, there's just so many layers of information. I think everybody else learned a lot too, especially since last webinar. So we won't see the next webinar until the 26th of January. But there is this Arise and Resist conference happening at the Roxbury Community College. Maybe Cole has some other announcements to make. You can email questions at pi-masspeaceaction.org, and we will copy these questions, and hopefully Jeff will get to them and send you a text or talk about them. He did have a comment about the colonialism in Japan from last week's many questions on that. I don't know if he wants to explain that right now.
Zarina, if you can just, one more point I wanted to make that I left out is, there's this idea that Palestine never existed and Palestinians are a fake nationality. Of course, during the period of the British Mandate, it was called Palestine, and there was a government in Palestine, even though it was a largely colonial government. There was money, postage stamps, and passports issued in the name of Palestine. And there was a Palestine police force organized by the British that was called the Palestinian Police. And ironically, one of the main sources of recruitment for the Palestinian police were the Black and Tans who operated on behalf of Britain and Ireland in the interwar period to repress Irish nationalism. They committed many crimes in Ireland, and they became a prime source of recruits for the Palestine police. And by the way, many of them were sympathetic to the Arab cause in Palestine. So that's just one of the ironies, that British colonialism in Ireland got transferred to British colonialism in Palestine as well.
Thank you for everybody attending. Cole or Julie?
Thank you, everyone.